The silence stretched across Bagram Air Base like a held breath. Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne stood at the edge of the flight line, her gloved hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the mountains, broken only by the amber glow of runway lights stretching into infinity. In 3 hours, she would be airborne. In 4, everything would change. The briefing room had been thick with testosterone and skepticism. 12 Navy SEALs, their faces carved from granite and doubt, had listened as Colonel Martinez outlined the impossible, a deep reconnaissance mission gone catastrophically wrong. Team Bravo had been radio silent for 18 hours, trapped in a valley that maps called the Devil's Throat, a narrow canyon where helicopters went to die and rescue missions became recovery operations. "We need someone who can get in low, thread the needle, and extract our people," Martinez had said, his weathered face grim. "The terrain is unforgiving. One mistake and you're painting the rocks." The SEAL team leader, Master Chief Hendricks, had looked directly at Kestrel when he spoke. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a job for." "For who, Chief?" Kestrel's voice had cut through the room like a blade, quiet but sharp enough to draw blood. Hendricks didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he meant. The same thing they always meant when they looked at her 5'4" frame, her regulation bun that never seemed quite regulation enough, her call sign that sounded more like a death omen than a badge of honor. They saw a woman in a man's war, a pilot who'd earned her wings through affirmative action rather than skill, a liability wrapped in Nomex and false confidence. What they didn't see was the daughter of a crop duster who'd been flying since she was 12. They didn't know about the night exercises over Afghanistan, where she'd painted targets with her 30 cannon so precisely that ground commanders started requesting her by name. They couldn't fathom the mathematics of death she calculated in milliseconds, the way she read wind patterns like a native language, the surgical precision with which she turned the A-10 Thunderbolt II into an instrument of salvation rather than destruction. The coffee cup trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear but from the adrenaline that always came before a mission. Somewhere in that godforsaken valley, 12 men were counting on her to do what everyone said couldn't be done. The same men who wouldn't meet her eyes in the briefing room, who whispered about quotas and politics when they thought she couldn't hear. By sunset, either she'd prove them wrong or none of it would matter anymore. The mountains kept their secrets well, and the Devil's Throat had never given back what it swallowed. Above her, the first stars were already fading. Dawn was coming, and with it, the kind of mission that separated legends from obituaries. Kestrel Thorne had spent 5 years being underestimated. Today, she would remind them all why her call sign was Banshee, because she was the last sound her enemies ever heard, and the most beautiful sound her allies could hope for. The A-10 waited in the hangar like a sleeping predator, its twin engines and distinctive profile promising either redemption or ruin. In the growing light, Kestrel could see her crew chief performing final checks, his movements precise and respectful. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez had never questioned her abilities, never doubted her right to be here. He understood what the others refused to see, that competence had no gender, and courage wore no uniform except the one earned through fire. As the base began to stir with morning routines, Kestrel felt the familiar calm settling over her mind. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd dreamed of since she was a girl watching her father dance his crop duster through power lines and grain silos. The sky was calling, and somewhere in the Hindu Kush, 12 of America's finest warriors were waiting for an angel of death to become their salvation. The mission briefing had been clinical in its brutality. Team Bravo had been tasked with reconnaissance on a Taliban stronghold when their extraction helicopter took an RPG to the tail rotor. The bird had managed a controlled crash into the valley, but now both the SEAL team and the flight crew were trapped in what intelligence described as a geographic kill box. The canyon walls rose 300 feet on either side, too narrow for traditional helicopters, too rough for ground vehicles, and too heavily defended for a walking extraction. The terrain makes it impossible, the meteorologist had explained, pointing to satellite images that looked like knife cuts in the earth. Winds funnel through that canyon at 40+ knots, shifting direction every few hundred meters. Add the altitude, we're talking about operations at 8,000 feet, and the math just doesn't work. But Kestrel had stared at those images and seen something different. Where others saw impossibility, she saw precision flying. Where they calculated failure, she saw the kind of challenge that separated competent pilots from those who earned their place in aviation history. The A-10 wasn't built for pretty flying. It was built for ugly situations that demanded ugly solutions. "How long do we have?" she'd asked. Colonel Martinez had checked his watch with the expression of a man counting down to a funeral. "Intelligence suggests they'll be overrun by nightfall, maybe sooner if the Taliban decides to push their advantage." 12 hours, 12 men, 12,000 feet of mountain hell that would either make her career or end her life. The numbers had a poetic symmetry that wasn't lost on her. In the mathematics of warfare, everything eventually reduced to simple equations: altitude versus gravity, skill versus terrain, hope versus reality. The walk to her aircraft felt longer than usual, each step echoing against the concrete with metallic precision. Around her, the base was transitioning from night operations to day shift, a choreographed ballet of military efficiency that never slept. But today felt different, charged with the kind of electric anticipation that preceded either breakthrough or catastrophe. Rodriguez was waiting beside the A-10, his pre-flight checklist nearly complete. The aircraft loomed in the hangar lights, its twin General Electric TF-34 engines gleaming with promise and menace. To most pilots, the A-10 was an ungainly beast, slow, loud, and built for punishment rather than grace. But to Kestrel, it was perfection personified. A flying tank that could absorb damage, deliver precision firepower, and operate from airstrips that would kill more delicate aircraft. "She's ready, Major," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd never sent up an aircraft that wasn't perfect. "Full load on the 30 mixed he and armor-piercing. I also loaded 2 AGM-65 Mavericks, just in case you need to make some new doorways." Kestrel nodded, running her eyes over the aircraft systems with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a patient. Every rivet, every panel, every weapon system had to be perfect. In the kind of flying she was about to attempt, there was no margin for error, no room for mechanical failure, no forgiveness for anything less than absolute precision. The mission folder felt heavier than it should have as she reviewed the intelligence one final time. Satellite images showed the crash site nestled in a narrow section of the canyon, the wreckage of the helicopter spread across rocky terrain like broken toys. Thermal imaging had confirmed multiple heat signatures, survivors, but for how long? Taliban forces were massing on the canyon rim, and every hour brought them closer to overwhelming the Americans' defensive perimeter. "Banshee, this is Tower." The radio crackled to life, cutting through her concentration. "You are cleared for engine start and taxi. Winds are light and variable, visibility unlimited. Be advised, we have traffic holding at the alternate field. They're standing by for your return." The alternate field. Even air traffic control was betting she wouldn't make it back to Bagram. The thought should have been daunting, but instead it crystallized her resolve. Every doubt, every whispered comment, every sideways glance had led to this moment. The sky was her courtroom, and she was about to present her closing argument. Engine startup was a symphony of mechanical precision, the twin turbofans winding up to operational speed with the reassuring whine of American engineering. The A-10 might not be pretty, but it was honest, a machine built for a specific purpose, and utterly reliable within those parameters. As the engines settled into their operational rhythm, Kestrel felt the familiar transformation from ground-bound human to aerial predator. This was where she belonged, where she'd always belonged. regardless of what anyone else thought about women in combat aviation. The taxi to the runway felt like a procession, each turn bringing her closer to the moment of truth. Tower cleared her for takeoff with the efficiency of controllers who understood the stakes, and suddenly she was alone with her aircraft, and the mountain dawn breaking across the Hindu Kush. The runway stretched ahead like a promise, and beyond it, 12 American warriors waited for someone to prove that impossible was just another word for challenging. The takeoff was textbook perfect, the A-10's powerful engines lifting her from the concrete with authority that brooked no argument. As the airfield fell away beneath her wings, Kestrel felt the familiar rush of freedom that came with flight, the sensation that she was finally, completely herself. The mountains rose ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks catching the first rays of sunlight and throwing them back in crystalline brilliance. But beauty would have to wait. Somewhere in those mountains, time was running out for Team Bravo, and the Taliban wasn't known for taking prisoners. The mission clock was ticking, the fuel gauge was finite, and the physics of what she was about to attempt bordered on madness. But madness, as she'd learned long ago, was often just another word for the kind of flying that separated legends from statistics. The radio crackled with air traffic control updates, weather reports, and the mundane efficiency of military aviation. But beneath it all, Kestrel could hear something else. The silence of 12 men who were counting on her to rewrite the rules of what was possible. The SEAL community had built its reputation on doing the impossible, but today they needed someone else to perform miracles. Today they needed Banshee. The flight to the target area was a study in calculated aggression, the eating up miles of Afghan landscape with mechanical determination. Below, the terrain shifted from agricultural valleys to increasingly rugged foothills, then to the knife-edge ridges and vertical walls that made this part of the Hindu Kush a graveyard for both aircraft and armies. The GPS coordinates burned in her mind. 34 degrees 52 N, 69 degrees 17 E, numbers that represented either salvation or catastrophe, depending on her ability to thread a needle that most pilots wouldn't attempt in a simulator. At 25,000 feet, she could see the entire tactical picture spread below her like a topographic map. The valley in question was a dark slash between towering peaks, so narrow it looked like a crack in the Earth's surface. Intelligence photos hadn't done justice to the terrain's hostility. This wasn't just challenging flying. It was aerial suicide for anyone who lacked either skill or desperation in equal measure. Banshee, this is Overlord. The voice belonged to Colonel Martinez, calling from the Tactical Operations Center. Be advised, we have eyes on the target area. Taliban forces are approximately 2 clicks from the crash site and advancing. Time is now critical. 2 kilometers. At walking pace over mountain terrain, that gave Team Bravo perhaps an hour before their position was overrun. An hour to perform a miracle that required precision measured in inches, timing measured in seconds, and courage that couldn't be quantified by any manual or training program. Kestrel began her descent, responding to her inputs with the mechanical obedience of a well-trained warhorse. At 15,000 feet, she could make out the canyon's geography in detail, a narrow gorge that twisted through the mountains like a snake, its walls so close together that her wingspan would clear them by margins that redefined the word harrowing. The crash site was invisible from altitude, hidden in the shadows of the canyon floor, but she knew it was there. 12 Americans waiting for someone to prove that impossible was just a matter of perspective. The radio chatter intensified as she approached the target coordinates, voices from the Tactical Operations Center mixing with updates from intelligence officers and weather observers. But Kestrel filtered it all out, focusing instead on the growing reality of what she was about to attempt. The physics were unforgiving. At this altitude, in these winds with walls that closed together, a single miscalculation would convert her A-10 into a 5-ton projectile with nowhere to go but down. At 10,000 feet, she made her final radio call to base. Overlord, this is Banshee. Beginning attack run. If this goes bad, tell Rodriguez his pre-flight was perfect. The response came back immediately, Colonel Martinez's voice tight with concern and admiration. Copy, Banshee. Bring our people home. The canyon mouth opened ahead of her like the entrance to hell itself, shadows so deep they seemed solid. Kestrel took a breath, adjusted her grip on the controls, and committed herself to a course of action that would either write her name in aviation history or carve it into a mountainside. The A-10's engines settled into attack configuration, their whine shifting to the deeper growl of an aircraft preparing for combat. Below, 12 Americans counted the minutes until darkness, while above, one pilot prepared to remind the world that heroism had no prerequisites except the courage to act when action seemed impossible. The mountains watched in eternal silence as Banshee began her descent into legend. The canyon walls rose around her like cathedral spires built by a vengeful god, their stone faces carved with millennia of wind, and weather into formations that seemed to reach for her aircraft with grasping fingers. The A-10's wingtips cleared the nearest outcroppings by margins that would have made her flight instructor reach for a defibrillator. But Kestrel's hands remained steady on the controls, her mind calculating angles and distances with mathematical precision. Wind shear hit her at 8,000 feet, a savage crosswind that tried to slam her into the western wall with the force of a giant's fist. The A-10 bucked and rolled, its twin engines screaming in protest as she fought to maintain control in air that moved like liquid chaos. For a heartbeat, she felt the aircraft sliding toward disaster, its nose tracking toward stone that would end her mission in spectacular failure. But training took over where courage alone might have faltered. Hours of practice in wind tunnels that simulated impossible conditions, thousands of simulated emergencies, and a lifetime of flying aircraft through situations that would have grounded lesser pilots all combined into muscle memory that responded faster than conscious thought. She adjusted aileron trim, added power to the port engine, and carved a line through the turbulence that brought her back to the canyon's center axis. The crash site appeared ahead like a wound in the landscape, the broken helicopter's rotor blades catching sunlight and throwing it back in desperate signals. Even from altitude, she could see figures moving around the wreckage, survivors, still alive, still fighting. Thermal imaging had been accurate. Team Bravo was intact but trapped, their defensive perimeter shrinking as Taliban forces closed from multiple directions. Banshee, this is Bravo 6. The voice crackled through her radio with the distinctive calm of special operations leadership under pressure. We have eyes on your approach. Be advised, we're taking sporadic fire from the eastern rim. 12 souls on board, 2 walking wounded, all personnel mobile for extraction. Master Chief Hendricks, the same man who'd questioned her fitness for this mission, was now counting on her to perform it flawlessly. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was no time for satisfaction or vindication. 12 American lives hung in the balance, and philosophical victory would mean nothing if she couldn't execute the extraction that everyone claimed was impossible. The terrain forced her into an approach pattern that violated every principle of safe flying. Instead of a gradual descent, she was committed to what amounted to a controlled crash into a space barely wide enough for her aircraft. The canyon floor rushed toward her at angles that made her altimeter readings academic. In this kind of flying, altitude was measured in heartbeats rather than feet. At 500 feet above ground level, she could see individual faces among the SEALs, their expressions mixing hope with the kind of professional skepticism that came from years of watching rescue missions fail. They'd been abandoned by geography, betrayed by mechanical failure, and written off by tactical planners who'd run out of conventional options. She was their last chance, and they were hers. The first ground fire came from positions along the eastern rim, muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars against the canyon walls. AK-47 rounds sparked off stone surfaces and whined through the air in trajectories that mapped the boundaries between life and death. The Taliban had spotted her approach, and were gambling everything on preventing the extraction that would deny them their prize. Kestrel's response was immediate and devastating. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon roared to life, its 7 barrels rotating with mechanical precision, as depleted uranium rounds carved through enemy positions at 3,900 rounds per minute. The 13 shells arrived with the sound of thunder, each impact removing Taliban fighters and their weapons from the tactical equation with surgical finality. But suppressing ground fire was only the beginning of her problems. The real challenge lay ahead, somehow getting 12 men aboard an aircraft that wasn't designed for passenger service, in a space too confined for normal extraction procedures, while under enemy fire and against a timeline that measured success in minutes rather than hours. The mathematics of the extraction were brutal in their simplicity. The A-10 could theoretically carry additional personnel in its limited internal space, but doing so meant violating weight and balance parameters that existed for reasons written in the blood of previous aviators. Add the altitude, the confined space, the enemy fire, and the complex coordination required to get 12 men aboard a moving aircraft, and the equation shifted from challenging to suicidal. Yet as she lined up for her final approach, Kestrel felt the familiar calm that came with absolute commitment to a course of action. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, doubt was a weakness that would kill them all, and hesitation was the enemy of the kind of precision flying that separated success from catastrophe. The A-10 responded to her inputs with mechanical loyalty, its engines settling into the rhythm of an aircraft committed to action regardless of consequences. The canyon floor was rushing toward her now, stone and sand and the broken helicopter that marked both destination and deadline. In the cockpit, surrounded by instruments that measured her progress toward either triumph or disaster, Major Kestrel Thorne prepared to prove that competence transcended every limitation except the laws of physics. And sometimes, with enough skill and determination, even those could be negotiated. The landing was less a controlled touchdown than a barely managed catastrophe. The A-10's landing gear slamming into rocky terrain with impacts that resonated through the airframe like gunshots. Reverse thrust screamed against canyon walls that threw the sound back in echoing waves, while Kestrel fought to keep the aircraft tracking straight on ground that had never been intended for fixed-wing operations. Dust and debris exploded around the A-10 as it skidded to a halt mere yards from the helicopter wreckage, its prop wash creating a sandstorm that provided natural concealment from enemy observation. Through the swirling chaos, Kestrel could see figures running toward her aircraft, the SEALs moving with the disciplined urgency of professionals who understood that extraction windows measured success in seconds. "Banshee, this is Bravo 6. Hendrick's voice cut through the radio static with authority born of crisis leadership. "Outstanding approach. We're moving to your position now. How copy?" "Copy Bravo 6, she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Engine running, ready for immediate departure. Get your people aboard and we'll discuss the physics later." The SEALs reached her aircraft in a tactical formation that spoke to years of training in hostile extractions. 2 men took overwatch positions, while the others began helping wounded personnel toward the A-10's limited passenger accommodations. The team medic was coordinating casualty movement with the efficiency of someone who'd performed similar evacuations under fire, his calm professionalism a counterpoint to the chaos surrounding them. Enemy fire resumed from multiple positions along the canyon rim, AK-47 rounds and RPG launches, creating a deadly crossfire that turned the extraction site into a kill zone. The Taliban had recognized the tactical situation and was throwing everything available into preventing the Americans' escape. Muzzle flashes sparkled against canyon walls like deadly jewelry, each shot representing someone's calculation that 12 American lives were worth the risk of exposing their positions. Kestrel's response was immediate and overwhelming. The A-10's cannon traversed toward enemy positions with mechanical precision, its firing solution calculated through targeting systems that reduced human beings to thermal signatures and ballistic problems. The GAU-8's depleted uranium rounds arrived with the sound of judgment, each burst removing enemy positions from the tactical equation with finality that brooked no appeal. But suppressive fire was only buying time, and time was a resource that depleted with each passing minute. The longer they remained on the ground, the more enemy reinforcements could arrive, and the more complex the extraction became. Already, she could hear the distant sound of additional vehicles approaching through mountain passes, their engines carrying the promise of overwhelming force that would render her firepower academic. "Last man aboard," the call came from one of the SEALs, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and sporadic gunfire. "We're loaded and ready for immediate departure." 12 men, 2 aircraft crew members, and combat equipment that pushed the A-10 beyond every recommended weight limitation. The physics were unforgiving. Overloaded at altitude, in confined space, under fire, with terrain that offered no forgiveness for pilot error. It was the kind of flying that existed only in emergency procedures manuals and the nightmares of flight instructors. Kestrel advanced the throttles with the smooth precision of someone who'd made peace with the possibility of failure. The twin General Electric engines spooled up to military power, their combined thrust fighting against gravity, altitude, and mathematics that suggested success was merely a statistical aberration. The A-10 began its takeoff roll on terrain that redefined the concept of improvised runways, its wheels finding purchase on stone and sand that had never been intended for aviation operations. The ground fell away with reluctant gradually, each foot of altitude gained through mechanical determination rather than aerodynamic elegance. Canyon walls flashed past her wingtips close enough to touch, their stone faces mapping the narrow corridor between success and catastrophe. In the passenger compartment, 12 of America's finest warriors trusted their lives to her ability to navigate physics that made survival a matter of precision rather than probability. Enemy fire followed their ascent, tracer rounds scribing deadly arcs through airspace that offered no room for evasive maneuvers. An RPG detonated against the canyon wall close enough to rock the aircraft, its shrapnel pattern spattering against the A-10's armored skin like deadly hail. But the aircraft absorbed the damage with the stolid determination of a machine built to operate in environments where survival was negotiable, but mission completion was mandatory. At 500 feet above the canyon floor, climbing through air that grew thinner with each second, Kestrel allowed herself the first breath she'd taken since beginning the extraction. The radios were alive with congratulations from Air Traffic Control, Tactical Operations Center, and aviation units across Afghanistan. But the most meaningful communication came from the passenger compartment behind her, where Master Chief Hendrick's voice carried respect that hadn't been there during the mission briefing. "Banshee, this is Bravo 6. On behalf of Team Bravo Outstanding Flying, you just performed the impossible." The impossible. The word carried weight that transcended aviation terminology, encompassing every doubt, every whispered comment, every assumption about what she could or couldn't accomplish. But impossibility, as she just demonstrated, was often merely another word for flying that required absolute precision rather than adequate competence. The flight back to Bagram was a victory lap disguised as routine aviation, carrying its overloaded passenger compartment through Afghan airspace with mechanical dignity that belied the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. Below, the landscape that had nearly claimed 14 American lives receded into tactical memory, its threats neutralized by superior firepower and flying that redefined the boundaries of what was possible. Air traffic control cleared her for straightened approach to runway 3, the controllers' voices carrying admiration that spoke to the aviation community's recognition of exceptional airmanship. Around the airfield, Aircraft from multiple services held their position, while Banshee returned from a mission that would enter military folklore as the extraction that shouldn't have been possible. The landing was textbook perfect, the A-10's main gear touching down with precision that contrasted sharply with the barely controlled chaos of her canyon operations. As the aircraft rolled out and turned toward the ramp, Kestrel could see crowds gathering, ground crews, aircrew from other squadrons, and command personnel who'd monitored the mission from tactical operations centers across the theater. But the most significant gathering waited near the aircraft parking area, a formation of Navy SEALs, standing at attention in dress that spoke to military courtesy and professional respect. These were the men who'd questioned her fitness for the mission, who'd wondered whether gender integration had compromised operational effectiveness, who'd measured her capabilities against assumptions that had nothing to do with flying ability. Master Chief Hendricks was the first to approach as she shut down the engines, his expression carrying the kind of respect that was earned rather than assigned. Behind him, the 11 men she just extracted from certain death formed a loose formation that spoke to shared experience and mutual recognition of exceptional performance under impossible circumstances. Major Thorne, Hendricks began, his voice carrying formality that transcended military protocol. On behalf of SEAL Team 3, I want to apologize for our assumptions and thank you for proving us wrong in the best possible way. The apology carried weight that extended beyond individual prejudice to encompass institutional assumptions about women in combat aviation. But Kestrel's response was measured, professional, and focused on the mission rather than personal vindication. "Chief, we all came home. That's what matters." It was a response that demonstrated the kind of leadership maturity that separated competent officers from those who earned lasting respect from special operations communities. No grandstanding, no political commentary, no demands for recognition, just quiet professionalism that spoke to character forged in the crucible of combat aviation. The debriefing that followed would become required reading for extraction specialists throughout the military, a case study in how superior airmanship could overcome tactical situations that defied conventional solutions. But the real impact was subtler and more profound. The recognition that competence transcended every demographic category except the ability to perform under pressure. Colonel Martinez arrived as the crowd began to disperse, his expression mixing relief with the kind of professional admiration that senior commanders reserved for subordinates who'd exceeded every expectation. The mission folder he carried contained preliminary reports, damage assessments, and tactical analyses that would be studied for years to come. But his immediate focus was on the pilot who'd just rewritten the manual on what was possible in combat aviation. "Outstanding work, Major," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command and the respect of one professional aviator for another. "That extraction will be talked about for decades. How do you feel about some time off?" Time off. The suggestion carried implications that extended beyond routine post-mission recovery to encompass the kind of recognition that came with performing the impossible. But Kestrel's response was characteristically focused on operational readiness rather than personal recognition. "Sir, respectfully, I'd prefer to remain on the flight schedule. The mission tempo hasn't changed, and the squadron needs every available pilot." It was an answer that demonstrated the kind of dedication that separated career officers from those who merely wore the uniform. No demands for special treatment, no requests for recognition tour or media interviews, just quiet professionalism that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal advancement. The weeks that followed brought changes that rippled through the tactical aviation community like concentric circles expanding from a stone dropped in still water. The extraction of Team Bravo became the subject of tactical bulletins, professional military education courses, and case studies in airmanship that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. But more importantly, it marked a shift in how combat aviation communities evaluated capability versus assumption. Kestrel found herself briefing extraction techniques to special operations units throughout the theater. Her presentations focused on the technical aspects of precision flying rather than the sociological implications of gender integration. The audiences were uniformly professional. Their questions centered on tactics and techniques rather than political considerations. The aviation community, she discovered, ultimately cared more about results than demographics. The medal ceremony took place on a Tuesday morning when the Afghan sun turned the Hindu Kush into a backdrop worthy of professional photography. The Distinguished Flying Cross was presented by a general who'd flown combat missions over Vietnam, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood the difference between routine competence and exceptional courage under fire. "Major Thorne," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled personnel with the authority of command and the respect of shared profession. "Your actions on this date exemplify the finest traditions of military aviation. In the face of impossible odds, you chose action over hesitation, precision over safety, and service over self-preservation." The medal itself was less important than what it represented. Institutional recognition that competence transcended every consideration, except the ability to perform when performance meant the difference between life and death. But as she stood at attention while the citation was read, Kestrel's thoughts were on the 12 men who'd gone home to their families, because flying precision had mattered more than gender politics. The special operations community's acceptance was more subtle, but ultimately more meaningful. Requests for her specific participation in extraction planning, casual conversations that included rather than excluded, and the kind of professional respect that was earned rather than mandated. Master Chief Hendricks became an advocate for integrated aviation operations, his conversion based on observed performance rather than political correctness. 6 months later, when another impossible extraction presented itself in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, there was no debate about pilot selection. The mission planning session included Kestrel from the beginning, her input valued for tactical expertise rather than tolerated for demographic balance. The assumptions that had once defined her military career had been replaced by reputation earned through performance under fire. The second extraction was textbook perfect, executed with the kind of precision that comes from confidence earned through previous success. No drama, no headlines, no ceremony, just professional competence applied to tactical problems that required solutions rather than recognition. It was the kind of flying that demonstrated how exceptional performance, once established, becomes the new standard rather than the remarkable exception. Years later, when military historians analyzed the evolution of combat aviation, they would mark the Devil's Throat extraction as a turning point in how the services evaluated pilot capability. Not because it proved women could fly combat missions that had been established long before, but because it demonstrated that institutional assumptions were often more limiting than physical or technical constraints. The A-10 she'd flown that day was eventually retired to a museum, its combat record including notations for missions that redefined what was possible in close air support operations. But the aircraft was ultimately just machinery. The real legacy was in the recognition that competence could not be predicted by demographics, only demonstrated through performance when performance mattered most. Kestrel Thorne retired as a full colonel, her career marked by innovations in tactical aviation that influenced doctrine throughout the military. Her final assignment was as commander of the Air Force's premier close air support training squadron, where she taught the next generation of pilots that impossible was often just another word for flying that required absolute precision rather than adequate competence. The lessons she imparted went beyond technical proficiency to encompass the kind of leadership maturity that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal recognition. Her students, both male and female, learned that respect in military aviation was earned through demonstrated competence rather than assigned through regulation or policy. The call sign, Banshee, became legendary in tactical aviation circles, not as a symbol of gender integration, but as an example of how exceptional airmanship could overcome situations that defied conventional solutions. It was a legacy built on performance rather than politics, on demonstrated capability rather than social engineering, on the kind of flying that separated legends from statistics. On her final flight as an active duty officer, Kestrel took an A-10 through the same Afghan mountains, where she'd once proved that impossible was merely a matter of perspective. The landscape below held memories of missions that had defined not just her career, but the evolution of combat aviation itself. The Devil's Throat was still there, its canyon walls unchanged by the passage of time or the legends that had been born within their confines. The radio was quiet as she flew through airspace that had once echoed with the sounds of desperate extraction operations and impossible rescues. But in that silence, she could hear something more profound: the absence of doubt, the disappearance of assumptions based on anything other than demonstrated competence, and the recognition that heroism had no prerequisites except courage and skill applied when both were desperately needed. The sun was setting behind the mountains as she turned toward home, its light painting the peaks in colors that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Below, the landscape that had nearly claimed 14 American lives stretched toward horizons that held promise rather than threat. The impossible had become routine, legends had become lessons, and assumptions had been replaced by respect earned through performance when it mattered most. In the end, that was all any pilot could ask for: the chance to prove that competence transcended every limitation except the laws of physics, and sometimes, with enough skill and determination, even those could be negotiated. The sky, as always, was the final arbiter of what was possible, and it played no favorites except those who earned its respect through precision, courage, and the kind of flying that reminded everyone watching that heroes came in all forms, but always with the same dedication to bringing everyone home. The mountains watched in eternal silence as Banshee completed her final mission, their peaks holding secrets that would outlast the airplanes, the pilots, and even the legends that had been born in their shadows. But somewhere in that silence was the echo of engines that had once screamed down in vertical dives, carrying hope to places where hope had seemed impossible, proving that sometimes the most beautiful sound in the world was the approach of someone who refused to accept that impossible meant anything other than challenging. The legend would outlive them all. Major Kestrel Banshee Thorne, the pilot who taught an entire military that competence had no gender, courage knew no demographics, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not against enemies, but against assumptions that limited what people believed was possible. In the end, she hadn't just extracted 12 men from a canyon in Afghanistan. She'd extracted an entire institution from limitations that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with prejudice disguised as practical concerns. Even the SEALs had looked away, until her A-10 screamed down in a vertical dive and reminded them all that heroes came in forms they hadn't expected, proving themselves in ways that made expectations irrelevant and assumptions obsolete. The sky, as always, kept its own counsel, recognizing only those who earned its respect through performance when performance was the difference between life and death, legend and footnote, impossible and inevitable.